And here we are. Stepping on each other already.
It's good.
Yeah.
Step on them toes.
So this week we did have an interesting conversation with someone that we recorded, but you won't get to hear it till later this month.
Right.
And so now, today, Monday, February 3rd, it's the Moped Outlaws riding tandem again. Just the two of us.
It's kind of an old school throwback.
Or a new possibility in the ever expanding possibilities of the world.
You know what I was thinking of? Remember when we used to look at what the day was, like what holiday was made up for the day, and we'd go into that?
We thought we were an FM radio station.
Yep.
Zes, hallo?
Blijven.
Bestuur zeker wegen dem.
Two outlaws on the lam, taking the back roads through America.
You can't drink enough coffee for this show.
And now it's time for Monday Madness with the Moped Outlaws, Greg and Mark.
So do you want to know what holiday? You know, it is.
It's February 1st. It's the Chinese New Year. A couple days ago, actually, the wood snake. But what were you going to tell us? Tell us.
Black History Month. International Women's Month. It's interesting.
It's interesting how those two things got sandwiched into one month. It's the shortest month of the year.
Right. Exactly. A lot of stand-up material there, probably done millions of times. So it is Doggy Date Night, National Carrot Cake Day, American Painters Day, anniversary of the liberation of the Battle of Manila, commensuration of the Batepá Massacre, National Women Physicians Day, National Golden Retriever Day. Boy, wow. Freed the Birds Day. Oh, remember that song from Mary Poppins?
No.
Really? Feed the birds, tuppence. It used to make me cry listening to that song.
Yeah, I think I've only seen or heard that music once or twice in my life.
Wow.
Last time I watched it was in preparations to go see the sequel, Mary Poppins 2, which I found delightful.
Oh, that's good to hear. I never saw it.
Yeah.
Because I was afraid my childhood visions would be shattered with a part 2. I was just watching Will Ferrell talk about why they never made an Elf 2.
What did he say?
Just couldn't create a script that warranted it.
Yeah.
He said, and they offered him buckets of money, and he said it just wasn't. Yeah. You know what I've learned? Don't put a hard candy in your mouth right before doing a podcast.
Well, I have some hard candy I've been saving since my Christmas stocking, but I haven't tried any yet. So
this is Christmas stocking candy.
See? The gift that keeps on giving.
Yep. It's a very fancy cream savers. Can you see that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I know someone that had some of that in her stocking.
Okay, I don't need to know about your private life, my friend.
Root beer lifesavers.
Hey! Reed's root beer?
Yep.
That's what I got. Oh, so World Market, huh? Santa goes to World Market.
Shh, don't tell the children.
You know, Santa has helpers everywhere.
You know, of the list of things that you were reading about, I was kind of interested in the Santa Blasti Combi Day. What was that?
The commemoration of the Batepá Massacre. Is that the one you're thinking of?
Yeah.
Oh, no. The liberation of the Battle of Manila?
No, the Batepá Massacre. I already know about the liberation of the Battle of Manila, which is brutal, but tell us about that other one.
Okay, so this is the Creole martyrs who, there's a lot of Spanish involved with this that I will. On this day in 1953, government colonists murdered hundreds of Creoles under the guise of a communist conspiracy. Unlike how the typical colonist tale plays out, this massacre erupted due to the protests of Creoles and their refusal to work under hard conditions of coffee harvesting. The massacre was led by Carlos Gorhula, taking the lives of innocent citizens through torturous conditions. The day is set aside to commemorate the Batepá Massacre, remembering and honoring the lives that were shamefully lost.
And this is 1953?
Yeah.
It sounds like something that's more like 1853, but here we are. It's 20th century massacres over coffee picking.
Yeah.
Was that on U.S. soil? Louisiana?
Well, it's the capital country of Sao Tome. Where is that?
Okay, so probably Colombia.
It is in Central African island.
Ah, a Central African island.
Its name is Portuguese for St. Thomas.
Got it. So the commemoration, the honoring of the memory of brutal labor practices designed to keep coffee flowing and prices low.
Yeah.
We might as well call it the Starbucks Massacre.
That's ugly. Oh, what a dig.
Yeah. Yes. Wow.
Well, you know, there's a friend who was telling me that it gets him down when he hears all the negative news about race relations and things, because he believes you could look at, there is historical evidence things are better today than they were let's say 50 years ago, 30 years ago.
Yeah. Perspective, right? Like E equals MC squared. It's all about how you observe it and where you're standing in the, right? Another take would be, well, since, the government rolled back DEI, that things have taken a downturn in the last 2 weeks. So,
right. But what's interesting is yesterday and today's Course in Miracles lessons are, yesterday's was, I am not a victim of the world I see. And today was, I created the world I see.
Interesting. Yeah, because we can choose, even if we are being victimized by oppressive forces, we can choose whether we identify with that status or not, and whether we are willing to accept and be conditioned to relate to it that way. And yeah, oof.
I know there's sort of a Pandora's box there, but it may be that, well, in the Course, it says that I am not a victim of the world I see is the key to our freedom, because we created the world we see, and therefore we can uncreate it.
Yeah. And there are lots of people right now trying to figure out how to uncreate recent events.
Some violently.
Well, yeah. And that's sort of it. Now we're brought into the cauldron of understanding ourselves and what we mean and what our core values are and what we stand for when we're pushed up against the wall of confrontation and conflict. To what degree does one resist and fight evil? It's tricky.
It is. And I think as a Jedi, you are a great example of the razor's edge of the warrior's path.
Interesting way to put it. Yeah. Well, even the Jedi are, occasionally will kill people.
Well, that's what I mean. There's a razor's edge there. And I think, Darth Vader was the characteristic of someone falling into anger and feeling righteous about it, and that being labeled as the dark side.
Yeah. And if we take this sort of metaphor that we have about this cultural fable, the Star Wars fable, it still brings us to the whatever position, because when you look at the arc of that character, he eventually realizes that no, he's going to toss evil into the abyss and save his son.
Right.
So each of us faces these trials on a day-to-day basis. And sometimes it's, big problems and big issues. And sometimes it's simple. Like, am I going to yell at my friend?
Hey, all good on that realm. Yeah. Can we have a footnote to that comment? Just
Sure. Sure.
Okay. This is a second recording because I threw a big ass fiery boulder into the first recording. And Mark was like, no, that is not going out to the world.
Yeah. There was some personal information. And at first I tried really hard to stay in it and be willing to share it. And it just became too much for me to handle. And so you won't get to hear that episode until 50 years after the Kennedy files are released.
They're released today, right?
Yeah. So we got 50 years to wait for the ghost episode. But nonetheless, there was this thing that happens between Greg and I sometimes where we disagree or my feelings got hurt yesterday. And so I was adamant about how that was feeling. And I managed to work through it and we talked through it and
which, by the way, I realized this morning when I woke up, I never really apologized. So Mark, I'm sorry that I hurt your feelings yesterday.
Got it. Yeah, the impact was difficult for me and I appreciate you saying that. And the past is the past. And let's co-create an even better, fun future for this podcast.
All right.
So to close the footnote out, I'll just say, folks, use your probiotics. Maintain good gut health. That's all I have to say on that.
All right. And do your best to listen to your friends when they caution you about the realm you're wandering around in.
Yes. Yes. Active listening is very powerful. And, courageous responses, courageous stepping forward. This is sort of taking us back away from the conversation, but I noticed someone today posting something about nonviolent resistance and right away in the comment, the third comment in was someone says, well, what about violent resistance? And I was just like, okay, here we go. The conflict just can't help but not be born, even in something like that conversation. And I was just, yeah. What are you going to say, Greg?
That historically, as I look around, the real major political changes of recent years, 60 years, have been nonviolent. Like South Africa was a nonviolent thing. India was a nonviolent thing. And these have been lasting changes. They definitely have their hiccups and 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But I know that all the leaders in both those countries were adamant about a nonviolent revolution. And knowing that there was going to be a lot of pain for those participating in the revolution because they were going to walk like this one that I know in India with Gandhi. There were all these soldiers and they were just going to walk up to them and they knew they were going to get beaten. And they just kept doing it and just walking forward. One of my favorite Zen stories. Have I told you the favorite Zen story of that samurai warrior who was just a fucking fierce, like ogre of an individual, raping, pillaging, burning? Have you heard this story? Okay. So he's heading towards this one little town in Japan where there happened to be a monastery on top of this hillside. And the townspeople learn that this raging samurai is heading towards their town. And they go and warn the monastery and everyone bounces. Everyone vacates. And the samurai comes roaring up on his steed, just, sparks flying from the hoofs, just dust and chaos all around him. And he rides into town. And the only individual there is this one lone monk sitting calmly in the middle of the road in the town. And the samurai goes riding up and gets off his steed and goes up to him and goes, "Don't you know who I am? I can run this sword through you and I won't bat an eye." And the monk calmly looks at him and says, "Don't you know who I am? You can run that sword through me and I won't bat an eye."
Yeah, I have heard this, and each time the tale is told, it gets better. What I flashed on while when you got to the end of it was the old TV series Kung Fu with David Carradine, where he's faced with this. He's an expert in Shaolin Kung Fu, and of course, his code of ethics is all about nonviolence, and so he has all this drama builds up in the TV show, and he tries to turn the other cheek or not get embroiled with it. He tries to walk away, like he does all the things until finally there's no other way to avoid violence. And then he is the supreme ruler of violence and executes it cleanly, efficiently, and with high effect. So, and I remember one of our mutual teachers from the Remember Institute used to say, "Hey, violence is part of nature. It's not that it's, we can't ignore that it's real. It's real. It's part of karma. It's part of nature." And so that leaves us with that paradox of wanting to create and embody the values that we believe in, which is, inherently about the ballot over the bullet or nonviolent social change. And then inevitably these cycles repeat themselves where we end up in conflict and wars. And it's hard to maintain that aspirational vision and that hope when you keep getting reminded how prone we are to this sort of thing.
As you well know, what really interests me in this is that always brings me to myself. Whenever I hear like this universal cycle of yin yang, and I'm like, okay, there's a war inside me. There's thoughts that are in conflict with each other. And my faith and belief is that if I find that element of peace, like I created the world I see, when I am in touch with the creator in me and know it to be real, not faith, not imagined, it's experienced, then I'll be at peace. There won't be any more conflict.
Yeah. It's a great practice to be in the awareness of. Also, the thing that we say, well, I don't have a choice. Like people use that justification for different things. And I like to believe that we always have a choice.
We do. Always. Right?
Even when there's a gun pointed at your daughter or, these other sorts of scenarios that we can dream up about where we don't have a choice. So
where the choice is hard. It's like an impossible choice. However, it is still a choice.
Right.
Yeah. And I think there's a human element of creating, like making up scenarios to justify a stance, but they're just imagined scenarios. Like, if I said, well, what if right now a big ass comet comes and smashes your house and my house? So X, and you're like, okay, Greg, what if?
Well, and where that becomes more problematic is when someone dreams up a story in order to cause discomfort and motivate others to do things that have a functional value in the way that the people who are telling them that story want power wielded. And we can enroll people in these fears and in these otherings of other people so that then they perform the violence for us on our behalf. So
this is always a question I wonder about. Do you think there really is
Santa
officially
Claus? Yes, I believe
formatted
in Santa.
oligarchy. Yeah, like does the Illuminati exist? Like it's really a faction of individuals who are vying for ultimate domination of everyone and everything, and are therefore honestly making daily decisions with media and social psychology, politics, markets, all these elements. And they're like, you know what? Let's raise the price of eggs to fucking $15 next week.
Right. The proverbial they.
Right. Exactly. Right. The proverbial they. Do they exist?
So here's my take on that. We have this tendency to say that sort of thing and have this meaning behind it. And the thing that we conjure in our minds about what the they is or how it works is not accurate in the they as to what the they actually is. And so there's this discrepancy between the way we think about it and how we talk about it versus what's actually there and of substance. And so my understanding, based on the limited initiatory rights that I've been party to, is that there are lodges, and the lodges are free associations between individuals for the purpose of social engineering. And those lodges can have a quality to them where their core values emphasize certain aspects of what those social engineering things might be. The tendency, I believe, is that within each of these lodges, there's the belief that they're doing righteousness. So to the extent that there is a they, like an Illuminati, if you will, the various lodges that I understand exist believe that what they support in their group orientations and the way that they get together and make decisions to sort of influence markets or influence cultures is based on the idea that they know what's best for others based on their prowess, their previous prowess. And a lot of it's built around status and power and money. Mm-hmm. And then the other pieces is there's secret lodges where you actually have to pass initiations and tests in order to be admitted. And so often people associate with the Illuminati with the Masonic order. And if you actually speak to 33 degree Masons, they will tell you basically everything except the things that are supposed to be kept private about the way the order runs. And they'll say that there's nothing about the lodges that are designed to foment evil and centralized power over people, but to shepherd and encourage the kinds of traditions that help men specifically, and there's women's groups too, but it's mostly male lodges, to have core values that resonate with the ideas of justice and, caring for how humanity grows social structures. And one of the weird offshoots of that is Shriners Hospitals, right? Which started out as charity donations to create burn hospitals where there were none, right? So many of the Shriners happened to be Masons, but not all Shriners are Masons.
Right.
And so the Shriners Hospital is a, very large organization that helps build things that alleviate suffering, right? And they network via Masonic orders, right? But not all Masonic orders are the same. There's the Scottish Rites temples, there's various things. And then, we get into other secret societies that are offshoots, like the Skull and Bones is the most famous one.
Well,
right?
the Bohemian Club.
And the Bohemian Grove is a kind of gathering place of many lodges, from what I understand.
My understanding is Bohemian Grove is where the Bohemian Club has this summer bacchanal. It's like summer camp but my understanding is it's a Bohemian Club element. There's a friend of mine who's a part of the Bohemian Club as an artist. He's a musician, and he got into it because he was invited to play in a band that plays at Bohemian Grove. And so that's from talking with him over the past few years.
So one of the oversimplifications of the question of the theys, my understanding is there's white hats, black hats, and gray hats. And each of those stands for different sort of core values. White hats want to do good for humanity. Black hats want to wield power for their own benefit, and they are under the mistaken identity that that's actually good for humanity as well. And then the gray hats are people who don't want to get pulled into either one of those particular things, and they keep an eye on them and make sure they don't get too out of a hand, each of them. I think one of the deeper things I've learned about the Masonic order is that they formed as a result of the persecution by the Roman Catholic Church, particularly persecution of Arabs and Muslims. And that one of the reasons for that is that the Moors who lived in northern Africa and who were part of the European cultural milieu brought with them really powerful things like algebra and the way architecture, works in certain ways that weren't understood very well by Europeans prior to that.
Right.
And when it became clear that the Moors were tied closer to Allah and the Muslim community, the Catholic Church considered that competition or an abomination or, not inside the realm of what they wanted to support. And so certain aspects of the Knights Templar were then attacked and decreed to be murdered. And so that drove them underground. And that also became a way for the preservation of these rites of passing along the information about architecture and mathematics and science. And the reason for the secrecy is so that no Catholics would get in and then make everyone subject to the torturous aspects of the Roman Catholic persecution.
Well, that's interesting because my understanding of the Masons is there is an acknowledgement of God. And kind of like AA, it's not defined religiously. It's just, it is. And a lot of the degrees, wisdom is rooted in biblical stories.
Well, I didn't actually participate in any kind of initiatory rites. I've known men who have been able to tell me what they can tell me without violating their oath of confidentiality. So, of course, what I'm saying is going to have an incomplete aspect to it.
Have you thought of joining?
I was actually approached by the Masons right after I got married in 1989. And my grandmother had sent them to try to recruit me. And I was intrigued because I know my father was, by the time he got out of high school, he had already achieved DMLA, which is the top level for, and my grandfather was definitely a Scottish Rites Mason. And he died long before I grew to be an adult. And my dad didn't carry on his Masonic practices after that for whatever reason. But there were a couple things that prevented me. One, the price of joining was high. Two, it would have required a commute to San Francisco to be part of the lodge. And three, I was very busy between work and being a newlywed and playing in the bands I played in at the time. I didn't really have the free time to do it. Now, I could have decided to make the time. And from what I've seen of other men that I've known in my life who did pursue the Masonic lodges, there was a lot of benefit to them, and they were able to create families and community in a way that I kind of envy now.
Well, there are lodges in Marin. There's lodges all over the place.
Yes, and I could, I think, join them, but I don't feel a strong pull to do it. Right. So
you're a Jedi's enough.
Yeah.
You're not giving that very much credence there, Mark.
Well, one of the amazing experiences I had was to be in a film and portray a Jedi, right?
What? It's not real. You're not a real Jedi.
Well, in a sense, there's no real Jedi.
What? Oh my God.
But if you take the mythical invitation to have a higher standard for yourself and look at the way the Jedi Order is constructed and the idea of holding yourself accountable to the light through the principles of non-attachment and service and humility, then that's a powerful allegory that George Lucas created for ways that we can seek our own behavioral improvements, right? For sure.
Right. Yeah. And I've seen you reference your being a Jedi in conversation with credence to a discipline of self. And what do you call it? Emotional
sobriety.
Yeah, emotional distraught. Emotional sobriety. Hey, what does that mean exactly? I think you've said it on a previous episode, but.
Well, emotional intelligence is the path to the practice of emotional sobriety. So one way to think about it is I can think about emotions in a way that's sophisticated and understand them through the lens of what's the physiology of it, what's the description of each emotion, what does it typically mean to feel sad or jealous or angry, right?
Of it and biology.
And then the actual understanding that emotions are energy in the body, right? We feel them in a physiological way where it's not just a concept that happens. Mm-hmm. Our face gets red, our breath gets short, and our teeth grit when we're mad, right? It happens in the body.
Yeah.
And then if you think about the way that various chemicals are released depending on what the emotional range is and what the depth of that emotion is, right? Super heavy grief involves crying and a kind of collapse of the body, right? And anger involves shortness of breath and like tightness in the body and potentially activating like behaviors that are physical in nature that might be, like acting out violently, right?
All right, so sobriety is...
So that's a form of intoxication because there's a hormone release. So the chemical makeup of your body changes and you're no longer in what we call rest and digest, or you're no longer in a stable place. You're in an intoxicated place. So if extreme sadness has you losing structure and will and have no desire to go on, then that's a kind of intoxication. So if you can clear the impact of that and stabilize yourself, whether you're activated and angry and prone to violence, or whether you're deeply wounded and sad and prone to inertia, you can change the state you're in and return to this equilibrium. We'll call that sobriety.
Okay. And for our visual viewers, we're going to now do a live demonstration. I'm going to poke the bear and we'll see it rise up.
That was the episode we canceled.
No, but
what would be very interesting about showing that was that I did get triggered and I did become louder and more emphatic with you verbally. And then over time, I used my breath and my words to restore my sobriety so that we could get to a place of where we had a more effective interchange.
Yeah, for me, what resonates is emotional sobriety as for me would be the ability to allow the emotion to live and not be reactive to it. So like be able to be like, oh, here comes grief. Okay, let it come. And it floods my body and tears flow. And like, I just surrender and I grieve. And then it passes through. And then I'm like, okay. And also to not hook anyone as the reason I experienced what I experienced.
Mm. Yeah, the relationship between thinking and the energy in the body is a powerful one, because we can continue to re-trigger ourselves with our thoughts.
Yeah.
Like we want to hold on to that juice of being angry or that victim story and being sad. So
Right.
we continue to replay the evidence in the way we think to reinforce and cause another wave of the emotional surge to happen.
And that's
So
what fascinates me. Like for me, my ex, there is still a story that brings me darkness, sadness, closing in, a hopelessness. And I know it is not the story of today as I'm sitting with you, but there's still life to it. And part of me is like, okay, maybe this lifetime, I'm never going to find the balm of that story.
well, that's what coaching and therapy can do, is help you go into the shadow of that and then alchemize it into something else. And so, ultimately the restoration of integrity or the reestablishment of emotional sobriety is a process of changing the chemical nature and the thinking that feeds the chemical nature into something else.
Yeah.
And we're not passive. We're not victims. We're not powerless over our emotions. And to the extent that we have training, we can begin to shift whatever the experience is in the moment into a place of where we choose to be. And this is how I think the brilliance of Stoics, like a lot of the legend around Stoicism is that it's the absence of emotion, and it's the imperviousness of the masculine. But the more I actually read some of the Stoics' writing, it's not actually that it's absent. It's that it becomes present and dealt with in a moment in a very conscious, articulable way. And so you notice your passions and you notice them rising, and then you, as you said, you allow them, and then you allow them to be shifted. Right. Because resistance just breeds, holding on to them, and they amplify in that sense.
And I'd say the practice is the ability to shift it quicker and quicker. I was just saying Tony Robbins, listening to something he said the other day, and he was talking about how the brain is a muscle. And, he said nowadays in interviews, he can always tell when the question's coming up. He sees a shift in the interviewer. And the question is always, well, don't you have days when you just feel like crap and you just want to stay in bed and eat Cheetos and everything just sucks? He's like, no, I had that in my 20s when I was overweight and, not happy with who I was and didn't like my life. But he said, but I've had a daily practice for decades of shifting my mental, like you're saying, mental sobriety.
Your whole state of being. It's all of it. It's your mental, your emotional, and your physical, all working together.
Right.
And spiritual too. Right. Because they're all related to each other. Yeah. And so one of the great things that we can learn from each other is how to create those shifts.
Yes.
And brotherhoods and community are about creating room for us to actually be able to fully express the deeper, shadowy aspects of self in a context where we can meet that part of ourself and be met there by others and move through it.
So I'd like to invite you to this meeting that's happening later tonight on Mount Tam at 11:46 p.m. We're all going to meet, and I think you'll be good there.
I'm sorry, I belong to this lodge.
If you had thrown the red nose on, that would have been perfect. Hey, you mentioned that you had a lot of time to binge a lot of shows. Does any show stick out as something where you're like, wow, that was a great experience? Yeah.
Okay. I've been very curious about Severance and the the concepts that are in that are interesting, and the way that it's photographed, and the way that the thing continues to kind of keep moving the mystery without necessarily taking away our desire to uncover it, which is tricky, right?
So are you watching it now?
Well, I don't think the next episode's out until the end of the week.
So you're into season 2.
Yes, for sure.
All right, because on the Ellis show they said episode 2 of season 2 is starting to give a glimmer of what's going on.
Yeah. But it's still intriguing. And then, there's levels of sophistication, right? Like, what I'm finding at 62 is that even though there might be stuff that's fluffy and I would like to have watched when I was younger, I just have become too discerning about writing. So really the criteria for me is that the writing has to be good enough for me to suspend my disbelief. So another show that I've watched is Slow Horses.
Oh, I love Slow Horses.
Right. And
that is excellent writing. That is so good.
I've watched the 3 seasons of the Bruce Lee show. Oh God, why am I Warrior?
Warrior, yeah.
I've watched that a couple of times.
Okay.
Because I love Bruce Lee, and I think there's some really interesting themes for that in our modern culture. That right. What else? I've been going back through some of the Disney Star Wars stuff that because later on this year we have another season of something called Andor, and so I watched Andor season 1 again so that I'd be up to date and fresh in memory. And then there's this character called Ahsoka Tano, who started out as part of the animated series Clone Wars, but has now got a live action show called Ahsoka, and they've had 1 season of that. But she's also been in The Mandalorian. There's sort of this character's now got quite a thread going through all of the modern Star Wars storytelling, especially since George hasn't been involved. And so I've been going back to the animated series that she's part of, which is she has an arc in Clone Wars, but then she also has an arc later in something called Rebels, to try and get a sense of what the different character contexts are for her, because I didn't really watch a lot of the animated material. I watched like the first 5 seasons of Clone Wars because it came out while I was working there, and it was like I was into it. But there's still almost 2.5 more seasons that I haven't seen in a long time, if ever. And then I haven't watched much of Rebels at all. And a lot of that feeds into where the current storytelling is from live action, and what the folks there, Dave Filoni and Jon Favreau, are working on. So I've been boning up on that because Star Wars, of course, is one of the cornerstones of my life as far as things I love. So that's stuff. And then I love documentaries. I'm about halfway through one called Blood, Sweat, and Tears, which was this band that was really popular and then suddenly dropped off the map in the early 70s. And it turns out that they were asked by the U.S. State Department under Nixon to go on the first ever rock tour behind the Iron Curtain. And so they lost favor with the American zeitgeist of rock and roll and hippiedom because they were misperceived to be part of the man. Right, because they went on a State Department tour of Russia, and so it's interesting to see them all talking about it and their experience of it. And it's like, yeah, where did they go?
They're the ones that did, it's cool, Mother Nature winning over. What?
Yeah,
no sugar tonight in my coffee. No sugar tonight in my tea.
I'm not familiar with that, so I don't know. I'm not really that familiar with their work, but I like music documentaries.
Did you see the music
song remains the same recently?
Did you see the music documentary that Questlove did about that was so fucking
and he just finished another one.
Wow.
But I don't remember the title and quite don't remember the name, but I think it's all of the different musical appearances from 50 years of Saturday Night Live.
You haven't seen that yet?
No.
I saw. Brilliant.
Where would I see that?
Peacock.
Oh yeah, so I don't subscribe to Peacock.
I'll give you mine.
Okay, don't tell anyone.
Don't tell anyone. Don't put this out to the world.
Yeah, that'd be great. I would definitely want to watch that because the documentary you did about that festival concert in Harlem was also amazing.
Yeah, that was
and
amazing.
it really seemed with that one that there was like a ton of footage that didn't get used. And I'm like, where's the sequel to that? I want to see some more.
Right. Well, with this one on Saturday Night Live, 50 years of music of Saturday Night Live, it's like 2 hours, 23 minutes or something, almost 2.5 hours. I could have watched another 2 hours easily.
Right. So that just tells you, like, imagine sitting down with 50 years of, 4-minute, 5-minute segments of bands and being like, how am I going to make 2 hours, 2.5 hours out of this?
Yeah.
And what's the story? What's the thread? Like, okay, well, chronologically, this is how it started. This is where it ended up. Right. But, you got to say something about the Blues Brothers, and you got to have that, like, well, Peter Tosh was on there with Mick Jagger and Keith Richards. And like, there's a ton of stuff, and then stuff that I don't even remember ever happening.
Yeah. I didn't know the punk band Fear was on Saturday Night Live.
Right. And then Sinead O'Connor tearing up a picture of the Pope was also on Saturday Night Live. So it's a musical watershed for sure, being on that show. And the last show I watched was the most recent Dave Chappelle show, and he had an artist on that was a female lyricist. I don't know whether to call her an MC or a rapper. I'm just not that versed in hip hop, and I don't want to just put my shoe in my mouth. But it was really interesting because it seems like when you host, you get to have a little bit of a say in who the artist is that's the musical guest. It's almost like you get to host and you get to pick who the artist is. That's my assumption. Is that in the documentary? Is that true?
They don't touch on that in the documentary, but I've heard that that's real, but they didn't say anything in the documentary. And so I don't know.
So that's another thing, is there's all this music that I never would have heard except for having seen it on Saturday Night Live. Yeah. And then someone did a lip syncing. Was it Christina Aguilera who did the
Mindy Moore, I think.
And she really paid the price. But but then there's a ton of people who lip sync anyway, but they just didn't get called out for it. Right.
Well, and they talk about what happened with that. Like, she was losing her voice. And by the time it came time to perform, she didn't have any voice really. And the show must go on. So, bad choice in hindsight, but you could see why it occurred.
Well, it was mostly the cruelty of the audience that drove that.
Yeah.
Like, if she'd gone up and said, "Hi, I wanted to sing for you tonight, but my voice is fucked, so we're just going to lip sync. I hope you enjoy the song and my dancing," then maybe it would have been okay.
Maybe. I don't know. You'll see in the documentary. You can pull your own thing. And I think that just reminded me, I heard that the Rolling Stones, when they did the Super Bowl, they insisted that they were going to do it live, that there wouldn't be a pre-recorded track.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I'm not sure about Prince, because I don't think he did any pre-recorded tracks
live. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm like, that's one of the main things that sort of distinguishes musicians of a certain caliber now. But a lot of people that I love, like, let's take Iration, for instance. They're a favorite band of mine, and I know them relatively well. I don't get invited to birthday parties or anything, but they have
too back in the day.
They have a whole system that runs off the Mac that times out the show, right? But it's not, there's no backing tracks on it. There's no like audio that's canned, but it's really an essential part of the way that the lighting gets cued and all the pyro gets cued and all those things. And I think that the more and more with these amazing technical shows, it becomes important to have a very consistent sort of clock and what's called a SMPTE, time code. But a lot of bands have backing tracks too.
Yeah.
And I think people start to get a little bit like, on the one hand, the audience was like, I want to hear it like the record. And on the other hand, they're like, oh, they use backing tracks. And it's like, well,
take your choice. I remember I saw Boston in like 79, and I was really disappointed because it just sounded like listening to the album. I was like, I mean, it was exactly dead on, note for note, the album. I was like, wow.
Well, the guy, Tom, who's the guitarist, singer, and well, I don't think he's actually the singer,
Right.
but he's the engineer that worked on that record. He's very meticulous. And so it doesn't surprise me that his shows were like, okay, it's going to sound exactly like I spent all this time making it sound good on the record, and I want it to sound that way in concert. And he did a lot of hard work on the physical building of sound equipment in order for that to occur at a time where there wasn't a lot of technology. He built a lot of his own technology for his studio and for those guitar tones. And it's interesting you should bring Boston up, because there's a thing that came out in the early 90s. No, it was the late 80s, called a Rockman. And it was a device that was very much like the Walkman of the time, which was a cassette player with little earphones. Well, the Rockman, you could plug your electric guitar into and wear earphones, and it had these killer tones in it. It had a really great, like, kind of rhythm tone, 80s style rhythm tone. And then it had this kind of crunchy rhythm tone rock, and then like a massively cool lead sound in it. And it turns out that a whole bunch of bands, especially hair metal bands, ended up doing a lot of their records with just this little box. The guitar is plugged into this little box and then into the board. And it's one of those old vintage pieces of gear that people are like rediscovering. And just this past weekend at something called NAMM, they released a new version of the Rockman on a modern pedal, because it's these classic sounds. And I know, like, if I could play you the video, you'd know, oh yeah, I know that. Right.
Fun.
And it's a bunch of those late 80s hair bands and stuff like that use the tone. I think Def Leppard, there were a couple other, Poison, a couple of those bands. I don't think Bon Jovi used it. So I don't think Richie Sambora used it. And I'm almost 100% sure that
what about Motley Crue?
I don't know about Motley Crue. Slash from Guns N' Roses did not use it. Okay. Right. His was like Les Paul, Marshall amp turned up to 11.
Yep. And shred.
Anyway. Yeah. But, you know, people like Bob Dylan, who sing it different every night, and Grateful Dead, same thing. You never knew what version of the song you're going to get. There's something to that, I think.
Yeah. I think I was reminded of Rammstein. There's a great documentary on YouTube about have you seen that? The crew and behind the scenes?
No, but you mentioned Rammstein to me a couple of years ago, and I watched a couple of tracks, and it wasn't really for me. But
well, their live show might be one of those things where you would have a great time, because it's just so amazing. But showing like how they have all this stuff computerized and ready with the light boards and pyrotechnics and stuff, but there's also a live person there to trigger things, so the band isn't tied to something that's pre-programmed.
Yeah. Well, and this is a metaphor for life. Like, don't let yourself become automated. Life's too short for that. Like, improvise, live a little, break out of your rut. Yeah.
Recording stopped.